Good evening. Thank you all for coming and braving the virus. The powers that be did take care of the rain, at least, so that shouldn't impede anybody. So we will begin tonight with an opening prayer by our host, Reverend April Herron.
Gracious God, thank you for the opportunity to be here this evening together. Help us to listen with open hearts and deliberate in a spirit of graciousness. Amen.
Short is good. We like that. Introducing the other members of tonight's panel, Reverend David Young, Neighborhood Church, Reverend Clayton Cobb, Presbyterian Church, USA, and Reverend Reinhard Krauss, Executive Director of the Academy for Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Studies. I'm Bob Rothman. Tonight's topic, searching for civility in a partisan world, is a very demanding subject to address, but it's also very important both nationally and locally that we talk about it. We have a big problem that affects our lives in many ways, and we look to our religious leaders to help us turn things around. I saw a bit of humor. In November, it'll give you an idea of the problem. There was a cartoon that said, "Be sure to discuss politics at the Thanksgiving dinner table. It will save you on a lot of Christmas presents." And unfortunately, I think that's good. That was good advice. So I think in order to address the problem, we always need to talk about the source of the problem. Where did it come from? Where does it start? And that would help us and find some way in our own ways to deal with it. So we're going to begin at the national level where it did begin, and then we're going to get to person, which is important directly to us. I hope to be a neutral moderator. There are things that we will talk about that I don't want to seem partisan, and I want to confess right off the beginning, I don't like either party. I don't like their leaders, and I don't like what they're doing. So if I say something, please don't take it as partisan, because I am not showing preference to anybody, and if I do, stop me. I don't want to do that. The moral principle is that honesty is mandatory for each of us, and even more so for our leaders to set the example. Yet a recent Pew Research Center poll found that 64% of Americans find it hard to tell when elected officials are speaking the truth. We're quick to grant exception to the need for honesty from our political people. We forgive them too much. We say they all lie, they all do it, and we don't hold the standards up that we as an electorate should hold. Today, there is no sense of shame for having lied and having distorted. I was thinking about that in terms of the McCarthy hearings of 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, 1950, when Joseph Welch said to Joseph McCarthy, "Have you no shame?" And that comment, as much as anything, brought down that inquisitorial persecution that McCarthy was so famous for. So I want to ask, what is the effect on our morals as citizens when we don't trust our leaders? Or am I overdoing it? I mean, tell me you don't agree with me. Reverend Krauss, why don't you start? You like to talk?
With the easy one, huh?
Well, they're all easy.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question that we live in a time of, I would say, shamelessness, or the lack of being able to feel shame for being dishonest. I'm currently started to read a book by the German philosopher Hannah Arendt. She covered the Eichmann trial famously and wrote a book that was very controversial. But she wrote also a book before that about the beginnings and the roots or the nature of totalitarianism. And one of her key findings is that the truth is being more and more obscured so that people are very confused by whether facts even exist or not. And she says this was both the case in Stalinist Soviet Union and also with Adolf Hitler. And he said both of them really didn't preach to the converted, but to those people who were average people and who at the end didn't quite know what is truth from fiction. And to me, this has very alarming parallels in our own society. So I think truth and fiction is possible to distinguish. I wish there was more teaching of critical thinking in our schools and university than there is, rather than an emphasis on just testing. But when my kids were little, I said to them, God has given each of you a brain, so you need to use it and not follow the crowd. So I think we still have that capability, but we live in very peculiar times. I don't know whether that's an answer. It's more an observation.
I think it's appropriate.
I just wanted to add one thing to I think it's the book you're referring to, the earlier book that was written, because it makes the point that not only is truth obfuscated and diminished, but that when people can no longer know what's true and don't know what to believe, then they can be easily controlled. That's the bottom line. Yeah. And that's very frightening.
Well, that leads directly into my next question. It's hard to discuss issues with friends if it becomes critical of a person, a policy, a party, because the immediate response is say, well, the other party does this. They won't stick to discussing the issues. They immediately counterattack with some other way, or they say it's fake news, which is the ultimate put down, I suppose. We now have a news network that conservatives go to, a news network that liberals go to, and they're all run where the advertising dollar demands viewership, so they have to keep drawing them in. It's a commercial world, and I somehow feel that Walter Cronkite and Edward R. Murrow and Hundley and Brinkley are probably screaming from their graves that that's not journalism, that's not the way to report something, and that's how we get it. So, to your point, Reverend, we don't know what is truth. Truth depends on the spinner, the teller, the reporter, and the listener as to what you want to believe is truth anymore. When I was in my ideal years, I've become a cynic a long time ago, I thought because of the same issue that I would take the big step and I would subscribe to the National Review and the New Republic. That if I read both, I should be able to figure out what's going on. That lasted one subscription cycle. It didn't help me at all. There is no middle ground. And where do regular people go to try to deal with this problem of doctored news, or what is news, or how do you know? I don't know. Reverend Herron, you want to step in on that one?
The story you just mentioned about getting 2 different subscriptions was from some time ago in your life?
Yeah, I was in my 30s.
So one takeaway from that story is this kind of divergence has actually been around for a while, and it may be exacerbated by a number of factors, news silos being one. But I do think there is a risk of, from the perspective of decades, saying, and I have quite a few decades myself, oh, it's just more horrible than it's ever been, and succumbing to cynicism. I have always remembered something Annie Lamont said about the generations, which is, as a parent, she came to this realization, it's important to us, for us, as the older generations, for the sake of the younger, to make it genuinely look and sound like life is worth living. And if we get too far down in the woe is me, then I think we leave those who come behind us more in a despair arena than a hopeful one. So while it's true we have a lot to overcome, we know that dishonesty is not a new problem. It's addressed a lot in the sacred scriptures. So what are the things that are as old as that in terms of communities and individuals and families taking responsibility for moral development, and nations taking responsibility for education and media literacy? Propaganda has existed for a long, long time. Yes, we have potent and powerful amplifiers of that now. And the last thought that was in my mind has now floated away. So I'll give somebody else a chance to talk.
So you think that by living straight and positive, that will bring about change? Do you think these people are going to change what they're doing if there's no pressure on them?
So you're saying the goal is to affect change in society. So I think how we live in our communities and in our families and as individuals is important. I also think we have to, if we want to affect change in society, we're going to have to find candidates that we'll feel good about, who are going to work toward policies that we think are going to make a difference.
I'd like to shift just slightly from what's true, what's not true, to this very well articulated history that April referred to Martin Luther King Jr., who we all remember talked about, we need to measure each other by the content of our character. And I think that it's incumbent upon those of us who care about these larger issues in society, as well as moral and ethical issues for individuals, that we need to hold our leaders to a higher standard of decency. Just decency. That's putting the argument of positions to the side, that somehow we need to hold our elected leaders and other leaders in society to a higher standard of decency, because it has to do with the content of our character. And that has really gone, I can say a lot more about that later. I'll let somebody else jump in. But
let me jump on this one and take it even deeper. At the risk of sounding like a religious cleric, paid believer, it really, I think, is a spiritual issue. And I'll tell you why. Even deeper than civility or respect, you have to drill down and say, well, why? Why should I respect you? Why should I let your opinion, be something we talk about? Why should I? And ultimately, if you keep asking that why, the why, it's going to come down to the sense of ultimately we may disagree, different race, different ethnic status, something between us, but there is an inherent worth that is God-given that I believe is in you and in me. So I think it comes down to that made in God's image, or you take Genesis 2, God's breath into Adam, gives an intrinsic value to that person that says, if I am uncivil to that one, then it becomes a violation of not just my brother or my sister, but it violates the us together and ultimately my relationship with God. So the challenge is, if you're arguing with your neighbor who you don't know goes to church or not, and you're talking about, we just need to be more civil, respect each other, and you start into the why, and what if they don't care about church? What if they're not a believer at all? And then you're kind of down to mom and apple pie and the Boy Scouts as good reasons as to why you need to be civil, or because your mother taught you, or you grew up in the South and you were kind of expected to behave. But I think it's deeper at a spiritual level, which then turns the corner. So what's our role, I think, is to interpret that truth. So when we say, pick your favorite example, that comment was wrong. All right? You can stop it and say, because I disagree. Super Bowl halftime, a political comment, fill in the blank, whatever it is, that's wrong. But if we stop there and somehow don't say, and because we're each worth more in the eyes of God, somehow that's going to change the conversation, which I would then hope, if anything's going to move the needle, it's not because, okay, you're this party and of that party, and we're going to respectfully disagree. I mean, look at churches. The budget negotiations in every financial committee of every congregation has to make decisions. And they disagree, and we negotiate, and we make compromises, but somewhere through that you say, because each person matters. So I would want to tilt it to kind of that deeper spiritual intrinsic worth of people, value at the deepest level, and how do we find that more often?
Well, in fact, the value, when you become a deep partisan, you are discounting the worth of other people. You're not giving them credit for intelligence. You can vote differently and still be a good person, but there's no credit, there's no recognition of that. You're just drawing down a curtain and saying you're behind it and I'm in front of it when you become deeply partisan.
I would like to add a little something to what you said, Clayton. I think religion, the worship of God, the dependency on an ultimate power or a creator, means that it's also community forming. If you do this together, you consider yourself both dependent, or all of you dependent on this creator, this creative power, however you name it. I think that is really the strength of religion, the community forming power. It's also the danger, because the question is, how large is this community? What you were just saying is ultimately it needs to include all of humanity, right? Because we have one creator. But I am not sure that in our religions, in our respective religious traditions, that has really sunk in, that if we believe there is one God, then we're all cousins. And that hasn't somehow sunk in. And if my neighbor doesn't believe that, well, that's her or his business. But for me, as a believer in this one God, she is still, or he is still, a cousin. So I think it's incumbent on religious people not to be tribal, but to recognize that the belief in one God, by necessity, implies that all of humanity is one family.
I would agree, and again, the challenge is, what if your neighbor doesn't care about belief at all? So that becomes this. Let me back into it this way. So imagine a neighbor who doesn't come from a faith perspective, and for some other reason you hear them running down someone else, being uncivil, disrespectful, and you could almost ask the question, well, why? What prompts your anger, your prejudice, your lack of civility? And one can say, well, because I hate those people. So you otherize the person. And maybe that's just, we're used to that. Somehow I need to know that somebody is less than me. I get that. Or number two, maybe they grew up in a household that was just, they were taught that. You can also unlearn that, but that may be part of it. Maybe it's just a calloused heart that you just have a hard one. Or maybe it's just a rank insecurity. So the motives, the reasons are rampant. But the end result is still the same. It isolates you.
Right.
There's an intrinsic loneliness that comes with a lack of civility. And I guess the question is anybody in touch with that? Are you aware how lonely this makes you to be such a horses behind in this conversation?
But that gets us back to the question, if political leaders, religious leaders can get us to the point of being isolated, then we are being able to be manipulated. If we are not communities standing together in solidarity.
So no, we name the truth.
We name the truth.
Discounts people, and that makes us lonely and separates us.
Don't forget your microphone. So
Yeah. Well, it's dangerous to believe that you can build a better world through the dehumanization of other human beings.
Easier, yeah. Well, for some.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think we really need to stress, being in a sanctuary, that people who have no religion, who are atheists, agnostic, do not have the corner on hating other people. Right? So we need to really look at ourselves, at the religious wars. Just an observation, I notice our moderator has arranged it that we only have Protestants on the panel.
Thank God.
I am not sure whether we are especially affected by incivility,
Or maybe Lord have mercy, maybe is a better response.
whether we are affected by incivility in a special way, or whether you thought we had special wisdom to dispense. I think it's the former.
It's because you're most numerous in the community.
Yes. Yes. But in the country I come from, in Germany, we had in the 17th century a war that lasted for 30 years. It was fought over the right way to worship among Christians. And 20% of the German population was killed in that war, and in some areas it was 50%. That would be the equivalent of 160 million people in this country over religious hard-headedness. So religious people certainly have their share of guilt and blame to take for being uncivil. So we have come a long way, that we are not bashing each other's skulls in here, but actually sitting here with microphones. So we should be grateful for that in some sense.
Well, these same people, many of them attend church and listen to their pastors talk about the Sermon on the Mount, and that you are to love your enemy. And certainly if you can love your enemy, you can go that far with somebody you disagree with politically. It wouldn't seem to be as big a step. But this doesn't seem to occur. It's getting worse, let me put it that way.
You think it's getting worse?
I do.
Given that we don't kill each other anymore?
I think
It seems a step forward.
I think that since the days of Truman, Eisenhower, that the politics has gotten much nastier, and as an amateur historian, I've looked back and tried to compare and see where things like this have happened before. The most outspoken disagreements that I see in American history occurred in the 1830s when Andrew Jackson was setting the country boys against the city boys, or the issues were very strong, one or the other, and there was no middle ground particularly, and so there was a lot of noise and a lot of disagreement. But I think we have gotten worse. And the example I cited of the news that we accept is an example.
I agree, Bob, that there are plenty of things one can point to. And the blessing or the curse of the public, I'll pick on the political world, is so much is just seen and heard immediately. The entertainment world, sports world, there are avenues to which you can say, boy, that was a great statement. How could he have ever said that? However, isn't it the role of the faith communities to model and point out how one might respectfully engage another over such issues? And so, in some ways, politics becomes very local then, to the particular congregation, the particular faith leader, the session, the board, whatever the governing body, how they communicate to a congregation, what the milieu is about in the feel of a worshiping community. And you walk in a place, you feel this is cliquey, or this is very open. So I think we do the best job locally of how to live that out differently, knowing there will always be, hopefully, the Mr. Rogers out there we can point to and say, thank you. And the others, we say, I'm sorry you said that.
I find myself in the very peculiar position of not being the contrarian tonight. So I am not sure things are getting worse, because one thing to point to is we have the internet, and everybody is lamenting, oh, we are flooded with propaganda. I am deeply, deeply grateful that for the cost of my internet subscription, I can read international newspapers from across the world, and I regularly do, and I hear voices that are not necessarily represented in the US press. I can read Canadian papers, I can read British papers, German, I wish I knew Spanish. I think that is a wonderful way of looking at a variety of voices that I would not have had the chance and didn't have the chance in my youth. So I think it's getting better, and it's up to me to make up my mind who is telling the truth, who is using words to blind other people, but that has been false prophets, so to speak, have been a perennial problem since Old Testament Hebrew scripture times.
Even before.
Even, of course, even before. The snake in the garden started it. So I think it's nothing new, but we have also, with the increase of more information, we also have more sources that are at our disposal, and we can make up our minds and use our critical faculties to say, this is not coherent, this does not make sense, this is not supported by the sources, and usually with a couple of clicks you can actually look up the sources. You can Google it.
If everybody were as honest and intelligent as you, the problem would not exist in the first place.
Oh, flattery, I'm not sure it's working.
Well, I mean, but they're seriously, and that was serious, by the way, but there is a major downside to the internet. Instant communication, instant point of view is spread to millions of people who subscribe to various things. Whether it's right or wrong, it's all over, it's out there, it's very strong. I mean, what do the totalitarian regimes do to control? They cut back on the internet. They don't want these things. But there are, every issue has its good and its bad. Please.
I think one of the reasons it seems, and we don't have necessarily the objective measurement, but it seems like things are worse, is because of social media. And I think it's important for us to realize that not everything we see on social media, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or something else, is actually generated by a person. So studies have come out that in 2016, 25% of the tweets that went out about the election were actually generated by something called chatbots, which are not people. It's a deliberate effort to make us think we have lost all semblance of civility. And same thing with Brexit in 2016. 33% of all the tweets weren't by real people, is the best estimate. And the media model on the news channels certainly would also give the impression that it's shouting louder and insulting with greater degree. I encourage people to fast from time to time, take a break, 1 day, 3 days, a week, take time off of watching the news and see how it changes your attitude about life, and then decide what you want your sources of information to be.
Yeah. The question is also, I mean, Clayton touched on it a little bit to say it's in some sense a spiritual crisis. Another way of putting it is to say, why are people so polarized? I think in our society, many people feel helpless and not being heard and seen and recognized. And there are very few spaces, perhaps in religious congregations, there are some left, where people actually can be heard and explain themselves for who they are. I'm always surprised these days when I say I take an Uber or I talk with somebody if they have time at the checkout at the grocery store, to ask some questions with the premise, I don't really know who you are. Let me ask you a question with the intention of saying, I would like to know who you are. I do not want to stick a label on you, but I'm genuinely curious. And I find myself again and again in very interesting, very personal, very deep conversations that people say, wow, you're actually interested? Tell me something more about it. And to me, the fact that they're different from me is actually not a detriment. It's actually a wonderful enrichment, because if I look at nature, if everything was roses or everything was daisies, the world would be quite boring. God created human beings in a variety of flavors, and everything vanilla would be boring. So when I go out with a curiosity and say, I'm interested in listening to you, rather than I'm wanting to stick a label on you, it becomes very interesting. And I think it's also something that each of us can do that counters this, in what camp are you? You saying something, oh, I know you belong to this tribe, you belong to this party, I write you off. But to say, tell me a little more, how did you come to this opinion? Did you come to it yourself? You can't be facetious, are you just following Twitter, or you are your personal guru? Then it gets demeaning. But with an actual personal curiosity, it becomes very interesting what people, when they feel they're being heard. And I think our problem in the world, we are becoming more and more a mass society where people feel isolated and not heard. And the counter force to that is you just shout louder, and maybe you shout with a whole group, you shout with a whole camp, but it's not working. I think we need to get back to actually finding spaces, creating spaces where we listen to one another in our diversity, and then it becomes quite interesting.
Yeah, and the lack of civility at the national level and in politics doesn't do anything to nurture that. In fact, I think just the opposite. You can't personally shame others into a more perfect union. And when people are shamed, when some of the behavior that goes on continues, it dampens down people's ability to feel that they can express themselves, that they can be the person that they are, because they're diminished and humiliated. And I think our democracy is stressed dramatically when ideology trumps truth. And we've been circling back to that idea of truth. But when ideology trumps truth, our democracy is tested greatly and may really teeter at some points because of that. And it's a tragedy when partisanship empowers ignorance.
I also wonder whether that is part and a flaw of our Western system that we have inherited from the Greek tradition in particular, not from the biblical tradition. Because the the Greek tradition is by definition adversarial. We want debates, and in a debate, somebody wins and somebody loses. It's a zero-sum game. Our judicial system is set up, you have a prosecutor, you have a defendant, and then whoever wins, whoever maybe gets the bigger salary and is better and have gone to a better law school, wins. We, in this country in particular, myself coming from Europe, notice it, we are addicted to fights. We want winners and we want losers. This is usually not how nature functions. Imagine, say, a beehive. If there are no winners and losers, if they don't cooperate, there is not going to be honey in the winter. And the model of nature is more cooperation, collaboration, learning from one another, rather than saying, I do you in and I'm the last guy standing. It's usually guys. So cooperation is more the way I think also evolution works, rather than winning and losing. But we are so used to winning and losing. The whole spectacle of the primaries is to say who is the winner, who is the loser, not who has the better argument. Oh, he made a good point. I mean, imagine in a debate saying, oh, you made a good point. I need to take that into account and think about it a little more. He would be considered, or she would be considered a loser if they thought that taking some insight from another person was a sign of strength rather than a weakness. And it's so embedded in our culture that I think we also need to rethink that. What does it mean to learn from one another rather than simply win an argument? And it's gotten to the point that we argue to the extent of seeking the personal destruction of the other person, and the respect is lost.
Maybe it's spring off of that to the phrase civil disobedience. Because somebody once said, we who are quite civil usually don't have very strong convictions, and those who have strong convictions usually aren't very civil, so it goes back and forth. But you think about, go back to the civil rights movement and the civil disobedience. And the question is, if I'm just polite, then I'm told, wait. And that was kind of the pejorative, nothing's going to change. Turn around, if you're a 12-year-old wanting to do something that you're not quite old enough, your parent thinks, and they say you just need to wait, it never does feel very good either. So I understand their limitations, but to move the needle there needs to be some sort of voices, pressure that somehow then says, we need to now make a change. Folks of color need to have status. They can vote. We respect. Folks lesbian and gay, we give status. Pick your favorite issue. Folks who are not citizens, what do we move that line? There's a whole bunch of range of issues. And some of them we have enough mass where we feel like we've settled that. We think they can still rear his head. Others it's more of on the front end. But it takes that a political leader to somehow give voice to that. And so the challenge is, in the giving voice to an issue that you want to see come about with a change, how does one articulate that in a way that doesn't otherize and diminish and demean those around us? How do we model that? And so I come back again to our faith communities are our best shot. I can't control DC, but I have a shot where at least I worship.
Amen. One of the principles that is part of American culture now is the importance of diversity. We see all the time encouragement and development of diversity in the university, diversity in the workplace, diversity in any given part of life. And the reason for that is that we say that it's important to have other opinions, but we don't listen to other opinions. We shut out the voices that we disagree with instead of listening to their arguments. Maybe they have something to say. One of the articles I read, the man called it a crisis of a crisis of contempt. That there are things to be considered and perhaps learn from listening to people of opposing points of view. And you should have enough confidence in your intelligence and your ability to listen to those things and give them consideration against what you've been thinking and be able to say, there's something to be said there. But in order to do that, I think you're asking for a level of honesty and intelligence that I'm not sure represents the electorate. Am I too cynical?
It's worth considering how we might get training ourselves in listening, because we've heard some lovely descriptions about what that might look like. So just in the interest of offering up one resource, someone in our congregation has gotten hooked up with an organization called Better Angels, and they have a deliberate format of bringing together Reds and Blues, Democrats and Republicans, and teaching people the steps and having guides so that it's a supervised conversation in which people get practice of saying thoughtfully what they see, think, believe, and then listening to what someone with a different perspective thinks and sees. And we've started to host some of those events here on Saturdays. There are a handful of flyers as you leave that say Better Angels at the top. If you're interested in the next one, it's coming up later this month.
When along those lines, when I was still a pastor and I had couples come who had trouble in their marriage and in their relationship, what I would sometimes do is ask them, request of them, to describe the position of the other person to the satisfaction of the other person. It is an extremely helpful exercise you may want to try. I mean, it doesn't need to be a facilitator. Those of you who are married in a relationship or with your kids, to go through this exercise to say, let us reverse roles and accurately describe what the other person is feeling to the other person's satisfaction. Because one can describe the other person, as we all do, by putting them down and caricaturing their position. It is an extremely helpful exercise to listen to another person, and it has tremendous potential for a restorative effect on a relationship.
I'll tell you what that's called. It's called the Talmudic Method, because I'm serious, when you study Talmud, and Talmud is the oral law, the Torah has the written law, the Talmud has the rabbi's interpretation and explanation, et cetera, of what's there. So when you study Talmud, if you want to disagree, in your mind, you're disagreeing with somebody who's been dead for 2,000 years. And you normally would study Talmud under a master, and the master would insist on exactly that process. Before you are permitted to disagree with this sage, you have to tell me this sage's position in terms that I feel that sage would accept. And only then are you entitled to offer a differing opinion. That would be a very constructive. I mean, I've often thought, what a way to around the family dinner table. No, don't argue. You have to tell this one what that one said before you disagree with them. That would be marvelous.
We can try it.
Let's do it. Sure.
April said something that triggered for me one of the things that kind of makes me chagrined is often following an election, either party, and both are guilty, the winners will say, America has spoken. And the answer is no. The majority of the voters spoke, but there's a sizable minority that would disagree. But the assumption that in the win-lose world, we won and then now you don't count at all, becomes this demeaning, discounting kind of assumption. And then, so you almost have to ask, if you go a little deeper to then the winner who won, well, what do you want to see happen to those who disagreed with you? You know, collapse and say, oh, you were right? Or do you want, back to what you're inviting, would you like some sort of meaningful dialogue that we might learn from each other? But those are the steps that, again, we don't see in the public world, not near often enough, but can we do with each other around a dinner table or with colleagues on a staff table or anywhere else in our present world?
An example that comes to mind as you were speaking is the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in particular the collapse of the East German government, which I never thought would happen in my lifetime. It was taken by the West German government as a victory. So all the West German politicians rushed in and said, we now show you how to run a government that is perfect. And over the last 30 years, this takeover, so to speak, has not worked very well, because now you have a lot of right-wing neo-Nazi movements in East Germany, because I think there was no conversation about what the system had been for several decades, and how can we learn from one another and perhaps craft a joint constitution that would serve both peoples. So I think it was a great missed opportunity, and Germany is still dealing with the fallout of this takeover by the victors. So that's what came to mind when you were talking. Yeah. Good point.
Well, we certainly don't see victors magnanimous in victory and defeated people magnanimous. It becomes much more like a sporting contest. You know, they want to pump and go high fives and do things like you said. We won, we beat them, we did this. And it's not conducive to the subsequent getting along. It helps to isolate. I have another area I wanted to bring up that on the political policy side. Political policies are often presented by their sponsors as moral issues. Politics is supposed to seek a compromise and find something in the middle, but how do you compromise when the arguments become religious conscience versus fundamental legal rights? Should every baker be required to provide the cake for a gay wedding? Should someone who regards abortion as murder be required to provide birth control for all employees? And on and on. These are issues that people have issues of religious conscience on both sides. And how in the hell do you even think about trying to compromise? It's a 0 or a 1. I don't see any way to get into that kind of argument. Do you? Does anybody?
No, I don't have an answer, but if I can share a little anecdote from the current campaign. Elizabeth Warren has dropped out, as we all know, but she was asked this very question by a reporter. What would you do with someone who has real problems with gay marriage in one of your constituencies. And so it was obviously a question to trap her, because you cannot give a right answer for a politician. You have to come down on one side or the other. So she said, first let me say, I would assume that this is a man who's asking the question.
That's diverting the issue.
That's diverting the issue. So yes. So no, this is not an example of good listening. But then she said, if this man had trouble with gay marriage, then I would suggest he doesn't get gay married, so he marry a woman. I have no problem with that. And then she got some applause, and then she said, well, if he can find one. So it's not, this is an issue of a negative example of not listening, but the reporter who asked her the question wanted to trap her, and she fell right into exacerbating the divide between people. So no, I don't have an answer how to resolve it.
I felt in watching the Democratic debates and then reading the news reports the next day and the subsequent days, the people who got the biggest hit, positive hit, were the ones who were the nastiest, who made the attacking comments, who really went to war with them verbally and exaggerated and took it all the way, and they did well in the debate. Negative campaigning is part of politics, and I think that too is more so. You hear more name calling now, I think. Maybe not. I mean, the world used to be more civil. I do believe it. Or at least the news agencies, the networks and the newspapers were more even-handed in the way they reported things, or less likely to throw in negatives just for effect.
Yeah, the part of woven into our politics is winners and losers. That's just the way the game is set up. But the sign of a great leader is someone who, after winning, can find a way to bring people together. That's happened better under some presidents and less so under others. But I think we have to look at the leadership of our country currently in terms of how some of the issues you've brought up for us tonight, Bob, have come more to a head. I think they've been present throughout history, as we've already discussed, but they surface at some times more than others. And frankly, while no leader, and I would say this is true in a local church, as I lead a congregation, I'm not responsible for the behavior and choices of every member of my congregation. At the same time, I set a tone and have a responsibility to lead by example. I think the same is true for our politicians, and the same is true for our president. And I think, without getting into a lot of political stuff, I think that there is some responsibility and accountability for that the behavior, I'm not criticizing the party, but the individual behavior of our president leaves a lot to be desired. And deceit is not a Christian virtue. T.S. Eliot said that, oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. And I think it's true. And I don't know an easy fix to it, except that I do think that a people will eventually, hopefully, find a way through the times when this lack of civility, which is, I think, very predominant right now, it will never go away. I don't think it'll ever go away. I don't think the name-calling or the backbiting or the pressure in politics will go away. But I do think that as faith communities, we have a responsibility to lead by example, but also to call leaders to some kind of accountability.
I find myself stuck on the question before the one we may be on now, when you asked about resolving conundrums and you gave 2 examples. And as I think about them, then it comes to me that 2 possible strategies, which I realize not everyone will embrace, for resolving questions like that is, one is accurate information. And so you put abortion and birth control next to each other as if they were the same thing, but they're not. So I just want to say that. And then another is that we shoot for consistency. So people doing business in this country are expected to serve everyone. They don't get to have a lunch counter only for white people. So based on consistency, my thinking is, and certainly open to hearing from others a different way to look at this, but consistency says to me then the bakery makes cakes for all their clients. So not so much that I'm trying to have a debate about cakes and gay weddings, but just to say, would the idea of consistency help us if we could hold ourselves to that?
Well, that is the way the legal decisions have gone, and I'm not questioning that. I'm looking at the response from each side of the argument for people who have deep religious convictions and feel that they're not giving their rights here. I can have some sympathy for them in that regard, even though I don't agree with their religious beliefs. And that was the point I was trying to make.
Almost to this point, slightly to the side, was reminded this week, kind of pondering kind of civility of, quote, a fine Presbyterian, John Calvin's theory of just war. It's in his Institutes. And the process of facing an antagonistic issue was that the leaders were to reflect first and check their own motives. Now, that's an interesting place to begin. That requires some self-reflection and to make sure they're not carried away with anger or that has seized their heart, but rather to have pity on the common nature in the one whose fault they're punishing. That's an interesting comment to the examples you just gave. And then what the sentence that I wrote down, it caught my eye. He said, so in essence, perhaps the thing we need to do is ask ourselves, what is the worst interpretation I can come up for my own motives in light of what's the best interpretation I can come up with the motives of others? Now, all of that requires some genuine self-reflection, which is lacking.
And maturity.
And maturity in our political world. But Lord, may it start with me. You know, one can only begin there. And then teach that and model it. Because again, if it doesn't come from the faith communities, where else will it come? So I put the onus back on us to somehow demonstrate, not shy away from, be involved, teach, educate. And certainly in every household, you know, are we giving the tools to parents? Are we just passing along the sicknesses and prejudices we hold ourselves?
The other way to make sure it's a just war is to have the two leaders face off first.
Tying in with what we have said, I think I come back to Martin Luther King Jr. I think that's why he was such a great leader, that he unflinchingly pointed out the injustices and the racism in this country, and at the same time didn't practice a policy of personal destruction of his enemies. He was talking about black children and white children playing together, rather than his community dominating the white community, which is what some leaders at the time thought would be the proper direction to go. And so this encompassing view of the enemy may differ with me on particular issues, but they are, in the ultimate sense, a human being who is beloved by God, even if I need to fiercely oppose what they're doing and the beliefs that they hold. I think it goes back to the very first comment that you made about being created in the image of God. It requires self-awareness, because the policy of personal destruction of the other is really, in the ultimate sense, idolatry, because it seeks to put us ourselves in the place of God, wanting to have the ultimate judgment of who is to have what opinion, and only if those who hold opinions different from us are eliminated, or at least their opinions are eliminated, will the world be good. That's quite a presumptuous perspective, and I would say it's, in the ultimate sense, in religious language, idolatry.
At the risk of one more story, in fact, the really smart ones among you may remember I shared this probably several years ago, but it's worth repeating. Oh, that one? Yeah, that one. Years ago in Northern California, my Methodist colleague down the road, his wife was a school teacher in inner city Oakland. And in that world, it was a pretty tough place to be a teacher. And so particularly so she wrote a book about some of the behavior issues and challenges that she encountered. And the name of her book was He Hit Me Back First, which kind of sums it up. And is the kind of P.S., well, he started it is never an acceptable answer for any believer, let me tell you. He started it is never an acceptable answer. But her story is, one day in class, and teaching junior high, and junior high kids can be brutal, but then so can adults. We're all good at it. But in the back of the room, there was a very large kid, probably, had a challenge or two for a year, and so he was probably older than others. And sitting in front of him was a younger kid to whom was the object of his disdain. And you could imagine in that classroom setting, the older one is just antagonizing and teasing and ridiculing and disrupting the class. So it came to the point where the teacher turned and asked the big kid, Johnny, would you please leave so-and-so alone and behave and listen? And of course it goes for a minute, and Johnny no sooner is acting out again. Teacher calls him a second time. Third time, Johnny, step out in the hallway, I need to talk. And they're out in the hallway. And the teacher says, Johnny, you and I have been here before. We know exactly how this story ends. I warn you 3 times. We step in the hallway. I send you to the principal's office, and you get expelled for 3 days, and you come back and we do this all again. So you know how that story ends. But let me pause and invite you to listen to that very wise voice inside of you. That voice that maybe has a different way to respond. And if that voice is encouraging you to do anything different than to go to the principal's office and come back 3 days later, why don't you listen to that voice? And if that voice is asking you to come back in the classroom and be a different person, I'll honor that too. You decide. Teacher turns around and walks back inside. Long minute, door opens and Johnny comes back inside, takes his seat, apologizes to the student in front of him, and sits down for the rest of the class and behaves. Would that ever be us?
Let me share a little story too. This is a wonderful story. It's a similar story, and my daughter is not here. She's grown, and I think she wouldn't mind me telling it. She was in kindergarten, and she does not take fools lightly. So I think it was it was in 3rd grade. We got called to the principal's office at Peninsula Heritage saying she hit another kid. I talked to her and she says, well, they started it. They hit me first. They started it. I said, well, that's not ever an answer. This happened the 2nd and the 3rd time. And so I said to her, Lydia, there is actually a trick that you can use. If somebody is really mean to you and that maybe they deserve to be whacked, I don't know, but you don't start it, but there is a trick if you count till 10 and then see what happens. And so she came back to me the next day and she says, Dad, it actually worked, but I had to count to 20. that actually solved the problem because she found a way to cope.
I like this divergence towards storytelling. It may be part of the overall solution. If we enjoy each other's stories, we're arguing less. I think I read the same article as you, Bob, about Arthur Brooks speaking at the National Prayer Breakfast this year and talking about the crisis of contempt. And then he said, civility is actually a pretty low bar. Jesus said, love your enemies. And it put me in mind of a story that Walter Wink shared in one of his books, and this is probably, nearly 30 years ago this happened now, but it's a story about a man who moved to Lincoln, Nebraska to be the cantor of the synagogue. And in Lincoln, Nebraska already was someone who was vitriolic leader of the Klan and white nationalist and was actively plotting and burning swastikas. And so the cantor called this man up. And what he knew about him was that he suffered from diabetes and was in a wheelchair. And so what he said was, I don't understand why you are such a fan of the Nazis. Hitler killed disabled people right up there with the Jews and the homosexuals. So can you explain to me your big support for this ideology? And the man was utterly confused by this phone call, and then the cantor went on to say, in fact, I actually called to see if, knowing that you're confined to a wheelchair and it might be hard for you to get around, do you need help getting groceries or some chores around? Is there anything that I could come and help you with? Which was equally flustering. So the guy hung up, but this man was determined to stay in conversation, the newcomer in town, and he got his whole synagogue praying for this man, and he just kept at it, calling from time to time, just trying to engage. Can you help me understand why it is you think that way? And finally, really hideous TV show, he was broadcasting his hatred, and so the phone call this time was really, please help me understand, how is it that you're spewing so much hatred? And the Klan leader finally said, I don't really know why, except that I have been like this all my life. This is how I was taught to think. This is how I've always acted and spoken, and I would really love to stop. And so at that point, he was invited over for dinner, which he came and shared with the cantor and his wife and children. He eventually did resign all of his associations with the Klan and the white nationalism. He made amends for people that he had injured. And when he got critically ill, and in his last, he had no family of his own, the cantor's family took him in, and he lived with them for the last 3 months of his life, and they took care of him. So I just offer Walter Wink's wonderful story. He is a collector of stories of nonviolence and peacemaking, and this is a story of loving your enemies that I think exhibits tremendous courage and creativity.
Would the networks and the media told more stories like that? They must assume that doesn't draw the readership that the nasty kind do, because you don't see those enough. And they're out there. They're all over. There are good people everywhere. And you would hope that the media would report some of this. This would be a very positive step in combating this problem we've been talking about. Clayton, I want to ask you a question. You have been on the road for the last several years, going to Presbyterian churches in the western region, in the cities, in the suburbs, in the small towns. Talk about the difference in opinions, the difference in the things you see along the line we're discussing tonight, as it dependent upon the type and size of congregation, location.
Bob's referring to when I left St. Peter's by the Sea, I took a position as a regional consultant with the Board of Pensions of the Presbyterian Church. So I had kind of Denver to Honolulu as my turf. Somebody has to do it. Might as well be me. Southern California is a world we know. As you get north of Santa Barbara, the Central Coast is eclectic. It becomes a fascinating place. Arizona is an interesting contrast to New Mexico. New Mexico, if you take kind of Albuquerque north, tends to be a little more progressive, and south of Albuquerque tends to be conservative. Arizona is just the opposite. Tucson is kind of the progressive end, and Phoenix north. These are broad generalities, but at least the churches, I could say, fit there. Colorado is kind of a Duke's mix, and God love Utah. Just so many Mormons, they're rarely find a Presbyterian there anywhere. But one story, I was heading to Bridgeport, Nebraska, because it's a little corner of the western Nebraska. It was part of this presbytery. And I was to do a meeting at 7:30, meet with a personnel committee meeting. And the pastor said, at 6:30 we have a community dinner. Come on, stop by for dinner. So I showed up, and I walk in, and here's a gregarious man who gives me a bowl full of chili and says, "Oh, you're early, great." And I was here for a meeting. He says, "Fine." And, we do this every Tuesday night. Really? He said, "Well, we host it here, but there are actually 3 other churches that take turns cooking, so you're getting Presbyterian chili tonight." "Ah, great. Well, are these church members?" "Well, they're from all 4 churches, but anybody from the community can come, whether they're hungry or just lonely." So I said, "Okay, this sounds great." So I take my bowl and I sit down, and no sooner a woman comes over and sits down to me. I say, "Hi, I'm actually here for a meeting, but I'm from California, and tell me, about yourself." She says, "Well, I work at the ethanol plant on the edge of town." I realized I've been seeing corn for miles, all through there. And I thought, really, ethanol plant, okay. And next thing you know, the grandmother comes down with a 13-year-old grandson, and she says, "Yeah, we come here every week because we love the fellowship, and my grandson at 13 shot his first elk on the weekend." I'm thinking, you gave a rifle to a 13-year-old, all right. And suddenly I realized, this is not California. And so the rural agricultural point of view, the flyover part of the country became a very clear reality. And at least I can put it in the realm of the Presbyterian Church, the leaders of that congregation kind of felt left behind and unlistened to. And I got to think that's a short step to the politics with an awful lot of Donald Trump signs I saw at that time, because that was the election in that season. So I see the church diverse, but most of all, change the question just slightly. There's a lot of hand-wringing, woe is me folks in the Presbyterian Church saying, we're heading down the tubes, the denomination is going to dwindle, we're not long for this world. And I got to say, I don't believe it, because I see too many pockets, albeit some of them small, but too much faithfulness and too much caring and genuine worship is never going to disappear. It still attracts. So I have a very positive view of the church, and my view of the country is the church adapts well in its setting, and they tell the stories they need to tell.
But do you think the politics causes as much friction between members of the community in the small town as it does in a big town?
I think it does, certainly, because the clergy will say, well, I have a congregation full of Democrats. I got a congregation full of Republicans. They'll tend to be that. But let me tell you it this way. Rare is a congregation is 100% of one or the other. So if you are a congregational leader, you have to figure out, how do you pastor a mixed crowd and do it well with integrity, modeling and lifting up and trying to teach some sort of civility in the midst of that world of disagreement. And I got to say, I think it's possible. Again, I come back to, I think we're our best shot. Now, I can't speak for the Rotary meetings in, Bridgeport, Nebraska. They may be a to-do, a melee. But I can at least tell you the church looked pretty healthy to me.
Okay. Reverend Young, you have Northeastern experience before you came here. In comparing, of course, you've been here for a number of years, so you're not current in the politics in that area, but you do have a feel for comparison of community discussion levels and types of things regarding politics, and I wonder if you share them with us.
I can't make any generalizations. It's certainly been true in my experience, and I think it's true for most pastors, that I've had mixed congregations when it comes to politics, and so it's usually, it's always interesting who says you shouldn't be political in the pulpit. But you get those pressures, and I always try to delineate. I never try to be political in the pulpit, but when you address issues of justice and biblical issues that are at the core of our faith, because now politics seems to cover everything, you can't address some challenging issue without it feeling to people as though it's political. But I've had those pressures all through my ministry, and they haven't really changed that much. The times have changed, the issues have changed, but the dynamic has really not changed that much. And it's not that different from where I served just outside the New York City area, in Greenwich, and here. So you still have those same pressures.
Are you allowed to be different? Do you feel comfortable being different in your home than in the church? And I don't just mean in private in your home, but the way you conduct your life outside of the church in the community that may not know that when you go to the grocery store or something, they may not know that you are a minister. Do you feel you have to could you put political signs in your front yard? Would you?
Could I put political signs in my front yard?
Yeah, wouldn't that be taking a stand that would...
My wife did one time when we lived in Michigan, and I heard about that, but my wife's my wife, and I'm not going to tell her what to do.
You can draw a distinction between
Right.
what Michelle does and what you...
Yeah, but back to your real question is, now I try to be the same person wherever I am. I don't try to be one person at church and another person at home and another person when I'm out in the community. I've had different dynamics. When I was at the largest church I ever served, I was in the smallest community. And so there wasn't anything I couldn't do in town that somebody didn't notice. But you live in larger metropolitan areas, you can have a more anonymity in your personal life. But I don't try to pretend to be somebody I'm not, especially the older I've gotten. I don't try to be somebody I'm not. Who I am is who I am.
Would you join a political party, become active in a political party, or is that contrary to...
I have. Oh, I can answer that question.
Okay, you do that.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Yeah. Because in addition, I mean, being a pastor is one role I play, but I'm also a citizen, and I have the rights and responsibilities of a citizen as anybody does. But I'm very clear when I speak publicly, and I should have probably prefaced earlier comments, that when in my tradition, we do not have a hierarchical system. It's a very flat polity, and the pastor does not speak for the congregation. We speak to and with the congregation. We teach, we preach, we challenge, we encourage, we question, but we never speak for someone else, because at the heart of our tradition is a deep respect for each individual. And that goes back to some of the earlier principles we were talking about. If we're going to have civility, there has to be deep respect for the other and appreciation, not only respect, but appreciation and a valuing of the other as a full human being who has also the right to speak their opinion and express their positions, and where one is not better than the other, but we share that together in community, and that's part of our tradition, and I value that very highly. So I don't speak, I'm not here tonight. I happen to be the senior minister of the neighborhood church, but I'm here, and when I've expressed myself, especially if it's pertained to anything political, that's how I feel, but I would never profess to speak for somebody else in my congregation.
The others of you, do you belong to political parties? Do you feel that that is something that is a trouble or not, or shouldn't be, or what are your thoughts about it?
I never have shied away to, if folks asked, I'd necessarily offer it, but they asked, and I said, yeah, I am a member of the Democratic Party, intend to vote that way, but not always. So that was, there should never be a mystery about where one stands, but there needs to be a lot of grace and freedom for someone to be, zealously a Republican of a different party or independent. I chose never to put a sign in my front yard because I felt that was tilting it a bit. And even for propositions, I still felt like I needed to play neutral, but never would shy if I had an opinion about one particular. And the latest one that came through on our last ballot, I thought it was a little interesting to watch the feedback about that. And wouldn't that have been a fun conversation? So I feel like how does one model appropriate civility in a political world? And you think, well, that's okay. Now, on the other hand, and I've told my wife I have a bucket list, things now that I'm retired, I don't have anybody's name to have to answer to. It's been on my bucket list to get arrested someday when I'm retired for some social justice cause and go down swinging, because I just think it'd be, let's go for it.
Bob, I want to make one more comment. We in our congregation, and congregations go through cycles and healthy periods and other times of unrest, or maybe because of leadership changes, churches go through different cycles, and sometimes there's conflict. Believe it or not, sometimes there's conflict in churches. And the neighborhood church went through a period of conflict several years ago, and the church leaders, in consultation with me, decided to come up with a church internal covenant. And we came up with 8 or 9 principles of normative behavior as to how we were going to agree to treat each other so that we could respectfully disagree and have different opinions rather than chewing each other up. And the one that kind of summarized the totality is that we agree that we can disagree without being disagreeable.
Is there anybody here who can help Reverend Cobb get arrested? To satisfy his big wish? Is there any auxiliary police here or somebody who can do the job? But there's your man. Question? One over there? Couldn't be one where I am. All right. All right. All right. Oh, what?
No, I was just teaching my friend over there.
Way up there. All right.
In the back, Bob. In the back.
Yeah, I got it now.
You'll get there.
I'm very interested in hearing a bit more about the internet, because I think what's going on in a lot of our political arguments and so forth is being fired up by the internet and social media, and there's no control on it. So anyone who would like to address that, and I am from the South.
Well, I think, Reverend Krauss, you're the one who talked about the glories of the internet. I think it's only fair that you respond to that one.
I don't really have so much to add than what I've already said. I've noticed my amount of time on social media sites is reduced. I'm now pretty much focused on my daughter's Instagram account, which every day has pictures of my grandson on it. It's a happy-inducing moment, and I'm grateful that Instagram exists and this technology exists. He lives in Brazil, and I'm watching him learn to crawl on my little phone screen. Otherwise, I wouldn't have that access.
I'll say, I appreciate Facebook, but I rarely chase the rabbit hole of anything political. Because who knows how it's generated, and if one wants to be informed, there are news avenues that do range from far right to far left, and some in the middle that are certainly worthy of subscription, and those are the places that I go to read and try to learn. And Facebook is clickbait. You're going to click on it, it's going to upset you, and then you're going to end up typing something you wish you didn't.
Along those lines, if I could do one thing with the internet, I would do away with the reply all key. These people who think that, somebody could say it sure is hot here in Dallas, and somebody responds all and gives them their political opinion of what's going on there. And occasionally I would say, I don't know you and you don't know me. Why do you think I want to hear your opinion? And they'd call me names. Any other questions? Sure.
Hello. This is a great discussion. I love all this. One thing I found, it seems that, I'm trying to formulate my question here, because what I've been thinking about is, it seems to me, I'm maybe not old enough, but I think just old enough to remember when we all used to stand up in school every morning and say the Pledge of Allegiance. And I also seem to remember more discussions about the civility of well, if that person did this to you, how would you respond to that? And so on and so forth. I don't know, going back to how the church operates, with these type of unifying things like the Pledge of Allegiance, these types of discussions, knowing that we are all together as cousins, so to speak, that being more spread apart now, it seems, through the immediacy of opinion on social media. How does the church then allow more of a perception of those of us who do sit in a pew on Sundays, right? Sometimes people think that, well, if you're Christian and you're conservative and you're closed-minded and all that type of thing, and actually I've kind of found that to be the opposite. How does the church bring that more to the public opinion that we're all not just conservative, closed-minded, and that type of thing?
Who would like to talk to that? How do you...
I think one response to that would be, it is very easy to jump to labels, to judge. It is also not a very spiritual attitude. I would say it's in fact the opposite of a spiritual attitude, because it fundamentally lacks humility. It assumes that I have the truth in my pocket. I can be passionately convinced about certain truths, but if I'm a religious believer, I always have to say, no matter how passionately I am convinced that I have the correct opinion, and I have not met anybody who says they personally don't have the correct opinion. But it should be possible for me, as someone who is committed to acknowledging the presence of God, to say, no matter how convinced I am that I am right, in the light of God, I could be totally wrong. And I think that humility is what people, especially religious people, every religious tradition teaches that, and I would say we don't practice it enough, but I would say that is perhaps the key, to say that we argue with the understanding and with the humility, the cognitive and emotional humility, to say, I could be wrong and you could be right. And we are both, as the Apostle Paul said, seeing in a glass dimly and not quite clearly.
Curtis, was your question about whether there was a way for us in the church to somehow present to the wider world the fact that we are not all clones of each other and we don't all think alike? I wasn't sure I entirely... So people outside the church have in their head what is the church, and everyone in the church must be just like it. Yeah, well, if the question is about the wider world's perception of us, I guess one thing we can do is tell stories among our connections outside the church. Like, I was at this thing this week where people came together to hear perspectives on thus and so, and there was a range. I think it churches have had big media campaigns. Our own denomination, one example, promotes open hearts, open minds, open doors. That may have drawn some people in. I suspect that more people get invited in and discover what real church is by personal invitation from people they actually know and interact with.
Well, I want to encourage all of you as much as I can to be in this very place on April the 19th. We're going to do something that is long overdue. One of the great limitations of religious education is that because of the limited time that's available to teach at the congregant or the seminary level, teaching is all about your own religion, and all religions treat education this way. And it made me realize in thinking that it would be instructive and useful to have a discussion. It is Jesus through Christian and Jewish eyes, so that each of us would have an understanding from educated, intelligent sources about how the other side looks at these things. So April 19th in this very room, and I would encourage you all. And I thank you for coming, and please join us for Interfaith Cookies.